Webinar. I think it's fantastic that the team in Botswana is doing this, especially around topics that we all know to be really, really important topics. I mean, when you're talking about ethics within the procurement sphere, you really are speaking about the heart of what it is we do and the decisions we make every day. So I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today. I've prepared a few slides. I'm one of those people who tries not to bore you with PowerPoint because I know death by PowerPoint is real. So it's very few slides, but I think we are going to have quite a lot to talk about. And just to give you an overview of where I anticipate our conversation to go today. I'm going to begin, obviously, with just a bit of introduction, who I am, where I'm from, what I do, and why I do it, because I think it's really important for context to understand who it is we're speaking to. And then I've broken down the conversation into what I think are three of the fundamental tenets, right? The first one being, why is ethics important? You know, there is an argument that even countries that aren't extremely ethical continue to flourish. So why does ethics matter? So to try and respond to that issue. Secondly, a bit of a conversation around, since we understand ethics is important, how then do we ensure ethical compliance, especially within the organizations we work for? Because a lot of us have maybe joined organizations that may not have strong ethical frameworks to support ethical behavior. What can we do, or what are the things we can change and suggest to try and move our organizations to more of an ethical framework? And then lastly, I want to talk really about the importance of CPDs. And I have like two slides that break down, you know, it's not just about continuous professional development. What are the knock-on effects of us ensuring that we continue to upskill ourselves and we continue to have conversations within our organizations about the importance of things such as ethics? So that's what I want to talk about. And maybe let's jump right into it and talk a bit about who Tsholofelo is, right? So I wear multiple hats. I've always been one of those people who's keen on learning new things and doing different things and trying to stretch myself. I think the three most prominent roles I participate in right now is, firstly, I'm the head of procurement at Impala Terminals. The region I'm responsible for is Africa, which is Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania. That's where the main terminals are. And then Australia and the UAE. Now, a lot of people ask me, you know, okay, so you were head of procurement for Puma Energy, Impala Terminals. How does that relationship work? And Impala Terminals is a sister company to Puma Energy. The two companies split into two distinct business units. And for a while, I was responsible for both business units, but I have transitioned all the way over to Impala. And I will be further transitioning away from Impala at the end of August to try and pursue what I believe is a bit of my passion. And that's private consulting. I'm going into business for myself. And I think there's a really exciting journey ahead. With more time on my hands, I'm excited about the impact I'll be able to bring to the procurement professional. So that basically leads us onto the second hat that I wear, which is as the Chief Growth Officer for Procura Insights. And you know, Procura Insights is basically the consultancy that I have started that I'm going to be running once I officially part ways with Impala Terminals at the end of August. And then lastly, you know, I do help out with CIPS Africa. I struck a really close relationship with Monica and the team. And a short while ago, they did ask me, hey, you know, if you could contribute with like thought leadership pieces, and whenever we have engagements, if you could be present and sort of share some of your insights, you know, what would that look like? And so that is a relationship that's ongoing. As you can see from all three hats that I wear, central to each and every one of them is supply chain and or procurement. And it's interesting because I initially hadn't studied supply chain. I started off studying law, which I hated, and kind of transitioned into procurement later on in my career. But it's something I'm really passionate about and something that I do devote quite a lot of my time and energy towards. So that's who I am, and that's where I come from. Now, let's talk a bit about procurement and ethics. And I've put there in the heading, you'll see procurement and ethics SCI, because it really is a SCI. I spend quite a lot of time trying to understand the relationship between what people perceive the procurement function to be in terms of its relationship with corruption and fraud, and what the relationship actually is. Because when you delve into the stats, there are more human resource managers and more finance managers that are convicted of fraud related crimes than there are procurement, logistics, and supply chain managers combined, right? Which kind of begs the question, if we aren't, statistically speaking, the most corrupt people within the organizations we work in, why is it that there is this overarching, undying perception that procurement professionals are either corrupt or they are corruptible? So, they may not start off initially corrupt, but if you dangle a large enough carrot in front of their face, you will be able to get something of significant value from them. And so I started to dig a bit, and I traveled back to the etymology of procurement. So where does the word, first of all, come from, and where does the function flow from? And if you go back far enough in time, you're kind of flung back to the early 1300s, right? And the word procurement is a lazy marriage between an old French word and a medieval Latin word. The old French word procuren, which means the improper use of influence. And then the medieval Latin word procuramentum, which means bringing something about by the actions of another. So in the early to mid 1300s, what happened either through war or romance is these words or these definitions found one another and converged into procurement. And initially, the basic definition of procurement was, the action of bringing something about by the action of another person through using your improper influence over them. And so what that means is, from the very conception, the way the idea of procurement and the idea of the procurement function was conceived was based on extremely negative perceptions. And the question then becomes, why has it been so difficult for us to shake those perceptions, 700 to 800 years later? And I think that's a bit of what we need to discuss today. Before I get into that, there's some really prominent, and this is me just trying to highlight the consequences of poor ethics, and how far-reaching our actions are as procurement professionals, especially with regards the advice that we give our organizations. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Siemens bribery scandal, which took place, I think it was 2007 or 2008. Somewhere in the late 2000s. And basically what happened is Siemens was moving around, and in its pursuit of trying to win more contracts and trying to grow its footprint and trying to multiply its revenue base, they were buying contracts from private companies, and they were buying contracts from government officials as well. So they were basically bribing all these officials. And at the time when this was discovered, Siemens was one of the leading businesses on the continent in terms of supplying telecommunication infrastructure, right? When the story broke, the brand damage that Siemens suffered was so massive that the distance between where they were in the mid to late 2000s to where they are now is almost incomprehensible. So the consequences of the organization's decisions to be fraudulent and to be corrupt and to participate in bribery ultimately destroyed the entire organization. Siemens no longer really seems to look as if though they're a going concern. So it's just to highlight the importance of being ethical, if only because of fear of the consequences that come with not being ethical. We talk a lot about the importance of ethics, and we try in many different ways to define what ethical behavior is. And I think because those conversations are so prominent one-on-one, but also so prominent on social media right now, maybe to elevate the discussion, we need to have a discussion about what are the enablers of ethical behavior, because we can't pretend that ethics exists in a vacuum, right? And for me, there are four, and the four of them are highlighted on the slide you're looking at now. First, you need a strong and committed leadership. Secondly, you need the supporting policy framework, and this can be organizational policy framework, but it also ought to be the policy framework of the country you're operating in. Third, there needs to be an emphasis on data-driven decision making, and that basically removes the subjectivity and the biasness from our procurement processes. And then fourth, training, learning, and development. Now, on the first one, there are a lot of very altruistic things that are said about leadership and what a good leader is, and then someone who smiles and has an open door policy. But for me, especially where procurement is concerned, good leadership is about, number one, leading by example. So if you expect ethical behavior from your team, then you need to be absolutely ethical all the time. And for me, that includes even in instances where there is a potential for a monumental business gain if you do something that maybe isn't unethical, but may create questionable ethical ripples within the organization. I think there's a fundamental responsibility as a good ethical leader to make sure that you are always towing the ethical line and you aren't ever doing anything that's questionable. Secondly, I think it's not enough for you to just be ethical in your day-to-day. You need to create the kind of environment where ethical and non-ethical behaviors are conversational, and there isn't a punitive approach attached to discussing things relating to ethics. When I was in Botswana a few weeks ago, and I think I would have met some of you at the supply chain conference, I spoke a bit about non-solicited bids, and I only really spoke about it because it was a question that was asked. And during the lunch break, when we're engaging with some of the attendees, someone came up to me and said, "Wow, you're so brave. I can't believe you spoke about, like unsolicited bids. Here, it's something that's completely taboo. No one wants to talk about it, yada, yada, yada." Because the perception is if you accept an unsolicited bid, then you're basically participating in unethical behavior, which, I mean, first of all, is incorrect. Unsolicited bids are a patent fundamental core tenet of the procurement process. But aside from that, I think the general fear around having conversations about things that may be perceived as slightly unethical further perpetuates more unethical behavior. There was a statistic I was reading about how at least 30% of all the people who participate in corrupt behavior are not even aware that they're participating in corrupt behavior. So, I've basically, as Sonke's boss, gone to Sonke and said, "Listen, I know you're looking at a bid for 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the supplier. Please just add them in." And I'm saying this to him the day before bids close, right? Now, if Sonke isn't familiar with the ethical paths he needs to take with a request of that nature, then Sonke is going to go ahead and do it. And he's going to be participating in what will eventually turn out to be a corrupt activity without him ever really being aware of it. So it's important for the leadership of any organization to drive these conversations about what is ethical, what isn't ethical, but also even where people hold unethical views. Having that discourse is the best place to help change those people's views on what is ethical and what isn't. In terms of the policy framework, I think I'm really excited about what's happening in Southern Africa right now. I know Botswana has new public procurement regulations. South Africa recently signed in their new public procurement legislation. There's a lot of work that's being done in Lesotho and Swaziland right now as well to kind of try and streamline our public procurement legislation to, number one, be as responsive and agile as it needs to be to respond to what modern global social, political, and business needs are. But also, number two, provide a framework of support for procurement professionals. Because, in the past, whenever you had a procurement disgruntlement, you rush to the High Court because they have absolute original jurisdiction, which wasn't a great place to go for you to deal with procurement matters. But also, this expediency with which those were dealt with was also slowed down because, you're in the docket right next to a murderer and a guy who swiped a cell phone somewhere. So the building of the kind of supportive frameworks that allow for the right tribunals, whereon the right people sit who have an understanding of what procurement is all about, I think that's going to be great. And it's really nice to see that happening throughout the region. So it's not just one country that's doing it, it's a number of them. The next step needs to be in our independent organizations, even if you aren't a public sector institution, we need to borrow from that public procurement legislation and see how much of it is implementable within our own workspaces to make sure there's as much standardization across the board as possible. Third, I said, was the emphasis on data-driven decision-making. So one of the biggest problems with biggest challenges, I suppose, with ethics and procurement is there is a lot of room or perception, because quite a bit of what we do, when it's unguided and isn't driven by data, is subjective, right? So if you don't do your gearing ratios or your liquidity ratios, the decision about which company is in a better financial position to do business with us becomes a subjective decision. And so when you eventually get to a point where you make your recommendations, what ends up happening is people look at your decisions, question you about them, and you're not able to provide the proof for why you have decided the way you decided. So we tend to be less and less transparent the higher the value of projects is, because we know we believe in what we decided, but we can't really prove to the next person the objectivity of our processes. So if more emphasis is placed on data-driven decision-making, we need to make sure that in that kind of environment, people are protected from the decisions they make. And wherever a challenge does arise, that challenge is responded to by absolute transparency. We're able to show that, listen, your liquidity ratio was 3 times over 1, your liquidity ratio was less than 1. Obviously, these guys were a better bet for us because we cannot afford to take any risks. And then the last thing is training, learning, and development. And I know Sonke is going to talk a bit about this later on, about, importance of doing the CIPS ethics test, but there's a lot of other CPDs that CIPS has available that you can participate in. And I'm going to talk a bit, I think in about 5 minutes or so, about why CPD is important and what the cycle of employment and education looks like without CPD and what it looks like with CPD, right? So let's talk a bit about how do we ensure ethical compliance. So we've said there's this etymological challenge, which is the reason why there are all these negative perceptions about procurement. We've discussed a bit about why ethics and procurement is important and some of the levers that enable ethical behavior. But structurally, we kind of need to respond to, okay, but how do we ensure ethical compliance in a standardized, homogeneous way across all organizations, right? And I think that there are two, I suppose, main points that each have subpoints under them. The first one, when you look at the existing frameworks of any organization, the first thing is there needs to be an overview of international regulations and standards. And this is to say, there isn't a single global standard right now that is accepted across the board, that has transparency backed by accountability measures, that forces procurement or supply chain professionals to behave in a certain way. And for me, this is a bit of a problem because it leaves procurement professionals in a world where you can kind of choose whether you want to affiliate with X or affiliate with Y, and that's always going to be based on what your subjectivities are, and I think that's not good enough. But also, even from a career progression point of view, I mean, you look at one job advertisement and they'll need you to be familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley, right, and what that says about procurement legislation. You look at another and they'll need you to have a minimum CIPS level 5. And I think there needs to be a complete overview of international regulations, and primarily because we understand procurement to be at the nexus of money flow within any organization. And what that means is, because we are spending the most money within organizations, if you want to protect the value of what you're spending, then you kind of need to make sure that procurement is standardized. And then secondly, within existing frameworks, how do you develop an effective compliance program? And for me, there are four main things we need to look at, right? Firstly, you need to have an understanding of what the unique challenges of the area you operate in are. And those could be unique challenges based either on the industry you operate in. So are you in mining? Are you in oil and gas? Are you in financial services? Each one of those sectors has very unique challenges. So you need to undergo a process of trying to understand what are our unique challenges, right? Secondly, you need to figure out within the existing frameworks that you've subscribed to, what do we do to address these challenges, right? And this is basically a process of solution mapping. So in mining, for example, within the South African context, there are massive challenges with communities feeling undervalued and feeling like they're receiving the short end of the stick because they aren't being given jobs and they aren't being given employment, which creates almost the impetus on mining houses to try and figure out how can we give as many people employment as quickly as possible? How can we issue out as many tenders as quickly as possible to pacify communities so that they aren't, protesting every time they're unhappy? Right? That is a unique challenge that has a very unique response to it. So you need to solution map around that. Third, once you've done your independent solution mapping, I think socializing is one of the most important steps in the creation of anything new, and we often miss it. Because what you need, aside from the perfect solution for an annoying problem, is you need cross-functional support for anything that you're going to implement. Without cross-functional support, you're going to have apathy, you're going to have lots of resistance to change, and irrespective of how great your change management is, if people are upset by the fact that they weren't involved in the solution mapping, then people aren't going to participate in what you want them to. And even if you force them to by threat of them losing their jobs or whatever, they aren't going to do it very well. So they'll just do it within the limits of what's necessary for them to continue to keep their job. Right? So once you've identified, once you've mapped solutions, once you've gone through a cross-functional support acquisition, you need to go to the fourth point now, which is implementation and continuous development of that, right? So you constantly look back at, have our challenges shifted a little bit? Initially, we struggled with communities. Now, maybe our problem is uniquely women in communities or youth in communities or HDPs within communities. And by continuously mapping whether or not your challenge remains the same or it's been responded to and therefore has transformed to something else, you're able to make sure that you continue to be agile and responsive and deal with whatever challenges you have. And then third, under existing frameworks, is looking at the role of technology and professional bodies. And I think, in terms of all the professional bodies that are out there, this is why I am extremely passionate about CIPS. Because, when I started my studying journey, I really didn't have much time, but I'd given myself a very limited period of time to complete my level 4 to level 6. And so I wanted to be able to write as many exams as possible in each exam sitting, which I did. But I was only ever able to do that because CIPS allowed me, and anyone who wanted to take proctored exams, right? So that use of technological integration to make people's lives more convenient and I suppose more efficient is something that I first fell in love with the organization. I was like, wait, what? So you mean I can sit at my house, switch my camera on, take my exam, and have my results in a couple of days? That's fantastic. But we need to move beyond, just enabling our members in terms of our value proposition to be able to access those amazing things and figure out how we further those into a kind of package offering that allows us to ensure ethical compliance. So whereas we have the ethics tests that we take every year to make sure that we're able to keep our MCIPS and so on and so forth, we need to figure out how do we move that education beyond the professionals who form part of our collective, right? How do we broaden that sphere as much as possible to ensure that the offering is ubiquitously available? And I think that's important because, and I think every single professional who's been in procurement for at least 4 or 5 years will tell you, sometimes the challenge isn't the procurement manager above you. The challenge is the manager who has no background in procurement. So those are the kind of people we need to bring into the fore and elevate their understanding of what the procurement function is, what it does, and why it's incredibly unethical for you to say to me, hey, we need 1,000 t-shirts, please call supplier X, they'll deliver by Saturday, right? That kind of education needs to come across. Before I go to the necessary improvements, Skillet, so maybe let me pause here and take 1 or 2 questions. I'm always really cautious about talking too much. I don't want to bore anyone to death.
Okay, I'll accommodate that. Thank you very much, Tsholofelo. I saw 2 questions. The first one reads, as a practitioner who operates in multiple geographies, how can or do companies effectively monitor and enforce ethical standards among their suppliers, particularly in global supply chains? It continues to say, on the flip side, how can small and medium-sized companies implement robust ethical procurement practices with limited resources? Should I go ahead and read the other one? Or you want to?
Let me take that one.
All right. Okay.
Because it's such an amazing question. So when I first joined Impala/Puma, a few months in, our bank accounts in Mozambique were blocked, right? We couldn't do any Forex transactions, and it's because historically it was nothing unethical or intentionally unethical that had happened, but historically what had taken place is, you need to expediently pay supplier X, so you do it from another entity overseas, or you need a certain supplier to come and fix something very quickly. Because for us, like if you have a tank out of service for 1 day, that's 200,000 US dollars. So sometimes you need people to come in and expediently deal with your challenges. So you bring people in without really properly onboarding them, and you run the onboarding process parallel to their execution process, which was a massive issue. And this especially in geographies with slightly immature, I suppose, legislative frameworks about how to deal with things like that. And one of the things I did, with not without quite a bit of resistance from the operations team, was I said, if we have to lose $1.5 million in 7 days, we are going to lose $1.5 million in 7 days. But we are not going to do business with anyone who isn't either already part of our preferred vendor list or hasn't gone through our diligent vetting process, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is it's important for you to have values and fundamentals and stick to those values and fundamentals, irrespective of what region you're working in and irrespective of the potential loss you're going to suffer. Because sometimes you try and do something by way of a shortcut and end up spending so much more money than you would have had you taken the $1.4 million knock and done things the right way. But even if that's not the case, even if you were never, ever going to lose a cent, I'm a big believer in the fact that you do the right thing all the time, irrespective of who's watching and irrespective of who's listening. And so, number one, we made sure that every single person we did business with had been vetted. And our vetting isn't just like, is your company registered and do you have a tax clearance? We go all the way down the eventual beneficiation chain, right? Like, so who really gets the money when your company makes a profit, right? Who are your suppliers and who are your suppliers' suppliers? Do we have like slave labor or anything like that along the chain? Because we don't want to do with business with anyone who's going to threaten our brand identity and the integrity of our organization. So I think that's the first thing, making sure that you are incredibly steadfast in your principles and in your values. The second thing has more to do with your own team. Because there hadn't been a head of procurement in that role for quite some time before I joined, the procurement team had almost a dotted reporting line into operations. And the priorities of operations were completely different from the priorities of procurement. So what ends up happening is the procurement team starts to flow with the needs of what operations wants, and then completely overlooks due process, completely overlooks procurement processes. So one of the things we needed to do was to make sure, number one, we provide the training, retraining, that is, in terms of what is good procurement, what is good ethics, what should you be doing whenever you want to move outside the process, because deviations will always be there. But secondly, we had to strengthen our accountability mechanisms because unfortunately, sometimes you need to make a very vivid example of someone in order for everyone else to understand that this is unacceptable behavior and it will not go unpunished. So I think irrespective of how large the geography of the area you're responsible for is, if you get those two things right, at least from a foundational point of view, I think you're doing great. All right?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. I'm gonna ask that you continue with the presentation. That was a breather. I still have two more questions on the chat, but I'll leave them for later.
All right, perfect. And this is just, my own personal opinion about, in terms of ensuring ethical compliance, what are the things we need to change and we need to change right now? Number one is our repercussion frameworks, right? Whenever you talk to lawyers or you talk to some of our friends in finance, I think most of us probably report into finance or have reported into finance at some point. The consequences of their misbehavior are very, very clear, and they're very, very dire. So it's not just like you will get a fine or you may spend 6 months in prison. It's you will not be able to practice this very thing that you've spent 6 or 7 years of your life studying for ever again if you're caught doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And we don't have something similar in procurement. There's a story that's doing the news right now about the senior procurement manager at I won't say the name of the company, I almost did, at a certain company. And they had been fired because they were caught, participating in bribery and things like that. And so they left that one organization, which was a government organization at a state-owned enterprise. And a year later, they applied for a senior manager role at a sister government organization, which was also an SOE, and they got that role. And it wasn't until by happenstance, they had a meeting with someone they had worked with before who raised the question, hey, wait a minute, how are you, and then obviously investigations unfolded and the role was taken away from them. But the mere fact that the current legislative and regulatory framework that we operate within allow for something like that to happen, I think is problematic. They aren't severe enough and concrete enough and long-term enough consequences for people who decide that they want to participate in corruption and fraud. So I think that's the first thing that we need to rethink. We need to be more stringent, we need to be more ubiquitous, and we need to standardize what our repercussion frameworks look like. Secondly, we need mandated, standardized value chain reporting. And what I mean by this, I mean, if you look at what's happening in ESG right now, at the end of the year, every company needs to report on their emissions, on their savings. And, if they don't have any, they need to come up with a plan. How are you going to make sure by 20XX, you're going to achieve XYZ, right? That's mandated. So even if you aren't doing anything, you need to put out a report with a plan for what it is you're going to do. We don't have something similar within procurement. I think what comes close is what the Botswana public procurement legislation has mandated, which is, I think, procurement reporting every 3 or so months. But even that isn't really standardized. And if you talk to most of the oversight teams, they don't quite understand what it is they need to be reporting on. Like, is this a metrics report? Is this a performance report? What exactly are we looking at? So we need the kind of report that says, here's how much business we've done in terms of our discretionary spend that we actually had control over, and we determined where that money was going to be spent, right? Here is our decision-making processes for how we landed on who it is we're going to spend with, because what that will do is it will tell you what are the things that matter to a company. So if in terms of your weighted scores, you give women-owned businesses an extra 10, that shows us that you value women-owned businesses. If you do nothing, it shows us that you value absolute competition, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And then thirdly, it needs to say, here are our key strategic partners, and here is what their procurement value chains look like, right? So if you're in mining and you do business with a Komatsu or an Imperial or a Barloworld, you need to be able to say in your report, Barloworld is a key strategic partner. Here are the key strategic partners of Barloworld in Barloworld's businesses, because only through doing that are you able to have a 6 or 7 company long value chain that builds your understanding of how ethical the entire value chain is, especially in terms of the 6 or 7 degrees that you have control over. So I think that's definitely something that needs to come to the fore. Again, I think organizations like CIPS are uniquely best placed to drive something like that. So even if you had like a point scoring system or, a discounting exam system for companies that made those kind of reports public, I think that would go a long way. And then third, anyone who's ever heard me speak has probably heard me talk about this. We need to deprioritize traditional performance metrics. If it were up to me, if I woke up tomorrow and I had the powers of God, right, I would remove cost from every single person's mind, because I think it is the least most valuable a metric that we could use to measure the performance of a procurement team. What happens when you prioritize cost is you inadvertently create value around the mechanisms that teams can use to lower costs. And a lot of those mechanisms are borderline unethical. So for example, if you were doing business with Mamotse Catering Pty Ltd, and they're charging you, I don't know what the going rate is now, $20 a plate for each one of your employees in order for them to provide lunch for you, right? What a cost-saving strategy does is it doesn't say, figure out how you can scale Mamotse's business and grow them into a business that employs a lot more people, generates a lot of alternative value or revenue from other companies in your industry so that they can be a stronger, more resilient partner to you. What cost savings says is you need to figure out how to move Mamotse from $20 to $18 or to $17, which does 3 things. Number one, it makes Mamotse completely uncompetitive because she needs your business. So she's definitely going to lower it to $17. But in terms of her own value chain, the knock-on effect is something is going to suffer, and it very usually is value or quality. What then happens is your employees are going to complain that the chicken wasn't cooked well enough. You are going to end your business relationship with Mamotse, and you have essentially destroyed that SMME. You've met your targets, but in terms of creating socioeconomic value, you've done absolutely nothing. Secondly, you teach your procurement teams to focus more on the bottom line or on the top line, depending on whether it's value or profit you're after, than they do on value delivery. And the purpose of procurement teams all across the world is value delivery. It isn't cost. It isn't your top line or your bottom line. It really is value delivery. So how do you create financial value? Yes, definitely that matters. But also, what are the alternative values that you can create? So how do you improve our brand strength within the country we operate in, or even outside the country we operate in? How do you improve our internal sort of like employee mini value proposition? So, if you speak to any young professional right now or any young graduate right now, the top 3 companies they want to work for in South Africa is Discovery, First National Bank, and possibly maybe Investec. But because everywhere you look, every single employee within those organizations always looks like they're having so much fun doing the things that they love doing. So we need to start looking at procurement as almost a strategic enabler than just like a deliverer of lower and lower and lower costs. So we need to deprioritize costs. That's the first thing. We also need to deprioritize unnecessary, stringent metrics that focus on exclusion than they do on inclusion. And the best way to do that is to look at alternative value. So you look at all of your suppliers, what is their offering aside from this cost issue? And you pick the best supplier based on that. What you can then do following that is have a discussion about, okay, fine. So if we went straight to your suppliers and we paid them at cost, what kind of markup would you charge us? Could you go down from a 30% to a 15%? How would that make your business continue to do well? So I think that's really important, right? So cost, please, like if you can, if you're in a leadership position and you're in this call, just try explore for 6 months, deprioritizing costs. And I'm not saying do something, irresponsible, like going straight for the most expensive bid that doesn't make sense. But if you have an understanding of what the market charges for something, try exploring deprioritizing costs and look at how much value you're going to create for your teams. Right. Second last slide. I'm going to try and rush through this a bit now because we are running out of time. Ethics and procurement, the Africa problem, right? We have 2 main problems on the continent, which is why we are so predominantly unethical in our operations and procurement. First of all, we have fragile economies. Fragile economies are like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You have a fragile economy, so a lot of people are either unemployed or they're employed, but it's not gainful. So, you work 40 to 48 hours a week, but you're only earning 2,000, 2,500. You basically pay for your transport to work. You have someone help you split the rent. You buy a little bit of food, and that's it. That's your entire life. That kind of person is in a position where they are incredibly incentivized to be corrupt because they basically cannot live, right? And if you explore Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the appetite for altruism is towards the top. And you can't expect procurement teams to be having strategic conversations about the importance of ethics and all these really beautiful altruistic things if their basic fundamental needs aren't met. So if your procurement teams aren't resourced enough and they're constantly fighting fires, so everything you receive is, we need this purchase order out by the end of today, we need those things delivered yesterday, your procurement team never has the time to pause and think about how do we deliver the procurement function in a way that helps the organization create or get more value, right? Secondly, under fragile economies is there's generally poor transparency, and I talked about this early on. The regulation thing, we're doing really well in SADC, but capacity is still quite a bit of a problem. I mean, I've spoken to many people who are a chief procurement officer, and they are literally the procurement function. So you are the only employee in procurement in that organization, and you're the chief procurement officer, so there is a capacity and resourcing issue, because the more under pressure people are in executing their responsibilities, the more difficult it is for them to, number one, make structured ethical decisions, but also, number two, to do well, right? You basically disempower them. And lastly, I've already spoken a bit about the poor accountability frameworks. And even when we do hold people accountable, it's never really the benefactor that we hold accountable. We look for the person at the top at the bottom who actually signed the purchase order. And that's the person that we give a fine, which I think is really unfair. But that's a conversation for another day. Then we have leadership worship. And this especially in Botswana, for me, it's a bit of how we're raised, right? With this over prioritization of Boto, and you need to ask, you should never be stern with your elders or your leaders, and you need to behave a certain way. There's a story about, I don't remember what country it was, but when they looked at the statistics, pilots from either this country or this region, the region is Asia, I'm not sure what country, were having a lot higher crashes than pilots anywhere else in the world, and they just couldn't understand it. And when they began looking at the cockpit footage, they realized that even where the junior pilot recognized that the senior pilot was doing something wrong, the junior pilot wouldn't speak up. And it was because of the similar leadership worship that I'm talking about, right? Because they had utter and absolute respect for the senior pilot, they were never able to say, hey, but I think you're missing the ball here. Or listen, we're all about to die. Can you pull the lever? And because they weren't ever able to say that, there were a lot more crashes, and that was problematic. And so what they started doing is they created training, first of all, to basically level that power playing field. And then secondly, they normalized accountabilities in both directions. So you had to account up to your manager, and the manager had to account down. I think that's another thing that we can look at, especially within an African context. Last slide, I promise, and quite possibly my favorite slide, is on the importance of CPDs, and especially the annual ethics test. I think it's a great barometer for how well you understand your job as a procurement professional. And it'll do a lot for you in terms of your day-to-day decision making. So on the left, if you're facing the screen, if you're facing away from the screen, you shouldn't be. The general flow is you learn a concept, and this is if you don't do your CPDs and you don't do your annual ethics test. You learn a concept, you're excited about it, you go to the workplace, you start to practice that concept. But because of workplace pressure and time, and your boss is shouting and finance is asking for the purchase order, and there are 100 of them that are outstanding, and you have 2,000 unread emails, you kind of start to do less and less stringent monitoring of the concepts that you learned. And in a fluid kind of way, you start to flow with the fish within the organization. So you do what everyone else is doing. You adapt to how your workplace generally executes on procurement, which is usually the wrong way. From that adaptation, those practices, if you do them for long enough, are normalized, and they're just poor procurement practices all throughout the organization. And then the cycle ends. So you spend the entirety of your procurement career within that organization doing the wrong thing. And then when you're put in front of a senior procurement person who's interviewing you for a role, you don't quite understand what your responsibilities as a procurement practitioner are, so you don't do well. Or even if you do well theoretically, when you join a new organization, you find it incredibly difficult for you to adapt. You find it incredibly difficult to do the right thing. The importance of CPDs and the ethics test are Once you've gotten to that normalized poor practices point, and this is on your right, when you do your CPD or your ethics test, that information of the concept you initially learned is refreshed. So you're like, oh, actually, by the way, there's no way someone should be sending me an after the fact purchase order like every month. Something's going on here. Once that knowledge has been refreshed, you begin to practice the concept. So you push back against unethical behavior, you push back against people doing things that they aren't supposed to be doing, even if those things aren't unethical, right? And that practicing the concept then flows back into, after a while, the pressure and all of that, and you adapt, and then you normalize poor practices, you refresh again, you practice well, and the cycle continues. So on your right, you're a better off procurement resource because you are constantly checking yourself and putting yourself through an accountability metric to ensure that you are doing the right thing all the time. Even if you go through a 2-month period where you've normalized poor practices because of the rest of the organization, you're always able to hold yourself accountable and check your behavior.
My name is Craig O'Flaherty. I'm the head of CIPS for Business at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Look after the SADC and East Africa regions. So Botswana is definitely one of our countries that we do quite a lot in, and obviously we've engaged with several clients over the years. I plan to take you through a few slides, hopefully not too many, about 6 or 7, about primarily the CIPS corporate ethics mark, because I think that this is one of those opportunities that CIPS doesn't communicate maybe enough, and as a result, it remains something that a lot of organizations are not fully aware of, and how to actually achieve the certification. So hopefully by the end of this short presentation, you'll be inspired to take the next steps and achieve your CIPS corporate ethics certification, and obviously receive the recognition that comes with that. So many of you will have seen the CIPS mission statement, but one of the things that you might not have picked up is that ethics is at the core. So at CIPS, we inspire and empower the profession to drive the transformation of supply chains for a more ethical and sustainable society. And as you can see, this is actually a screenshot that is used globally. Ethics is front and center. So ethics is part of our DNA, and it should be part of yours if you are already a member, or if you are thinking or wanting to become a CIPS member. So CIPS is governed by a code of ethics, which every member of the Institute signs and agrees to abide by. And that's to ensure that our members fully understand this undertaking and can be held accountable for their actions. So it's exactly what Tsholofelo mentioned. A lot of the times people are not fully aware. And as a result, we offer the CIPS Ethical Procurement and Supply e-learning for free on an annual basis. It's included in your CIPS membership fee. And I would encourage every single one of you to make sure that you do it on an annual basis. Like Tsholofelo mentioned, CPD and the ethics is vital. You should be doing it on an annual basis to make sure that you're keeping up to date with the latest in terms of knowledge. So this is an e-learning course which culminates in an online test. It's designed for anyone who works within procurement and SCM and needs to understand how to prevent issues regarding fraud, bribery, corruption, and human rights abuses. So why is it important? The profession, including our members, need to do more to change the perception. And Tsholofelo mentioned that perception, but unfortunately, perception is our reality, that everyone that works within procurement and supply is corrupt. And we need to do more to change that. So there's not a week that goes by where the media does not report on the latest fraud and corruption scandal, and inevitably procurement and supply chain are in some way linked. And for those South Africans that are on the call this evening, and I'm sure everybody in Botswana has seen as well across our region, it's been front and center for a number of years with the State Capture Commission, the Zondo Commission, and the findings that came out of that. A lot of SOEs, a lot of private sector organizations as well. So it's Steinhoff was in the news. So it's not just a public or private sector public sector issue. It's a private sector issue as well. So all citizens across the world expect better of their governments and private sector stakeholders. And it's up to us to try and make sure that we fill that gap and start having the conversations and encouraging not only our colleagues and our teams, but also, like Tsholofelo mentioned, the wider stakeholders, the CEO or the CPO, the CFO that maybe hasn't necessarily got the procurement background or the SCM background that needs to actually be brought into the fold. So CIPS provides a pathway which demonstrates your organization's integrity and commitment to ethics, helping to safeguard your procurement and supply chain and your reputation in the process. And I think that's critical. It's about making sure that your reputation at the end of the day is intact. And by taking the necessary steps to achieve the CIPS corporate ethical mark and a listing on the CIPS corporate ethical register, you can increase confidence in your organization and reduce financial and reputational risk. For yourself as an individual, obviously you can do that on an annual basis by completing yours, but we're talking now about trying to get organizations and the wider group to actually start taking this a lot more seriously as well. So CIPS now formally recognizes the organizations that are committed to ethical procurement and supply and to demonstrating accountability through self-governance. Ethical procurement and supply is defined by CIPS as processes which respect and address fundamental international standards against criminal conduct and result in progressive improvements in the lives of people and the environment. And there are 4 steps that you need to follow. So this is basically where it comes down to implementation, implementation, implementation. It's one thing to talk, it's a different thing to actually take action and to act. So the first step is to adopt the CIPS Corporate Code of Ethics. Make sure that that you do that tonight or tomorrow first thing. Go and have a look at it and see whether you can do this as an organization. Obviously, from an individual perspective, it involves signing up as members and trying to get the group to sign up as well. So encourage your colleagues. By operating procurement and supply management in accordance with this code, your organization can uphold ethical standards. And this is achieved by signing collectively, like I mentioned, as a group. The second is then to train and to test your staff, which Tsholofelo touched on as well. All staff responsible for sourcing and management of suppliers should be fully trained in ethical procurement and supply management. This 2-hour e-learning ethical procurement and supply training package with online test is available from CIPS and included as part of your CIPS membership. And it's actually regrettable that not more students and more individuals take advantage of it on an annual basis. A lot of individuals sign up for membership and forget about the CPD and the ethics e-learning. They're too busy with the studies, they're too busy with the modules, but it's vital. It's very, very important for everyone to take part. So organizations can also complement the e-learning with a half or a full day of skills training. And like Tsholofelo mentioned, we go into detail in terms of some of the other aspects around procurement fraud. And we also offer this for individuals that are not necessarily in the procurement and SCM department. So like I mentioned, those other stakeholders, business stakeholders that you're wanting to make aware of it. So we usually cover topics like procurement fraud and ethics, and these can also be virtual or face-to-face, depending on the size of the organization and the numbers of individuals that are going to be doing the training. And then the third step is to publicly state your organization's commitment. So there's a signing the CIPS statement of commitment. Your CEO or your chief procurement officer or supply chain manager or even the senior accountable officer reinforces your organization's focus on sourcing and managing suppliers ethically. And then the last step is to make use of the CIPS certificate and the kite mark. Once you've achieved it, once you've actually done the work as a group, as a collective, there are a lot of benefits that you can achieve as a group. And it's important that you make that clear and you use it as far as possible, because then other organizations will reach out to you and say, what is this? Why have you done this? Why is it important? So you reinforce why it is necessary to do it. And then obviously, lastly, to renew it. So on an annual basis, it's good for the group to renew it. And if you're doing it on a regular basis, it's actually pretty easy to do. You can see on the slide now the certificate for the Auditor General South Africa, and this is obviously an organization in the public sector that has recently completed the CIPS Corporate Ethics mark and the kite mark on the right hand side. So the kite mark is what an individual organization would use across a number of their collateral to demonstrate that they've achieved the CIPS Ethics corporate mark. The fact that the Auditor General South Africa has recently achieved the CIPS Corporate Ethics mark is really, really positive from a public sector perspective in our country, and I would urge you to have conversations with your colleagues as well in Botswana. And I'm pretty sure in due course, I have no doubt that they will be expecting other public sector organizations to follow in their footsteps. And it's really about trying to make sure that you are as strong as a collective as everybody. So if organizations are not prepared to do it, you should be the ones calling them out and saying to the individuals, look, we need to do this. We need to get serious about it. And there are obviously several private sector organizations that have achieved it as well, their certification. And when we are naturally, obviously encouraging as many private sector clients as well to follow in their footsteps, because we fully recognize that it's not just a public or private sector issue. It's across the board, and we need to hold hands. We need to partner on these types of initiatives. So over and above the benefits that are mentioned on the slide, which are mainly specific to the organization and to the individual, the organization will also receive the following, essentially being added to the CIPS Corporate Ethical Register on the CIPS website. And that is a global that's a global register. So all organizations around the world are recognized and are included on that corporate ethical register. So every single organization that is recognized globally will be there. And your organization can also use the kite mark, as I mentioned, on your websites, on your emails, on your email footers, for example, across your social media platforms. You can include it on brochures. So there really is a lot of value that can be attained from achieving the CIPS Corporate Ethics kite mark. CIPS also promotes the organization's achievement across our social media pages. And I'm sure you've probably seen several organizations being promoted by Malika, not just on our LinkedIn pages, on Facebook, but also in publications, driving positive PR and word of mouth. And that is all added value on top of everything that you do yourselves. So we do that obviously from a CIPS perspective to try and promote the organization, the fact that you've done it, and try and encourage others to follow in footsteps. And lastly, the individuals from the organization, so representatives from the organization will be invited to attend the CIPS Africa Conference and Awards and receive their official physical certificate at the awards. And this is also an opportunity, obviously, from a video perspective and from your colleagues and your peers, to be recognized for having done this particular e-learning as a collective, as a group, and achieving that ethics mark. So some of you may have attended the recent CIPS Africa Conference and Awards that we held in May, where we acknowledged a number of organizations that have achieved the CIPS Corporate Ethics mark. And I have no doubt in the next year there will be a lot more that also achieve the mark and are awarded their certificates at next year's conference. But I wanted to just play this video for the benefit of those that weren't there, so that you can see the focus and attention that we are driving across our region when it comes to ethics and to practicing ethical procurement and supply. And hopefully in a year's time, we will look forward to inviting you to the CIPS Africa Conference and the awards, and singing your organization's praises as the proud recipient of the CIPS Corporate Ethics certification.
Being listed on the CIPS Corporate Ethics kite mark serves as a beacon of trust and credibility. Our third recipient is the ABSA Group Limited.
So to end off with, this is truly an exciting time for the profession. Now more than ever, we need to take the opportunity to demonstrate that if done correctly, procurement and supply can be a force for good. And I encourage you to reach out to myself or any one of the team at CIPS to help you to achieve your CIPS Corporate Ethics Kite Mark and to make sure that next year you're also at the conference to come up on stage and to get the accolades. Thank you.